IT will start live now. Okay, so good morning, everyone. I am Hibatalla Adam, Assistant Professor of Economics, Assistant Dean for Academic Affairs for Jindal School of International Affairs, and the Executive Director of Jindal Centre for the Global South. Thank you all for joining this morning, the opening session of the first International Conference of Jindal Centre for the Global South on Financing for Development 2030 Global Agenda and Post-COVID-19 Challenges, which is organized in collaboration with the Indian Political Economy Association and the Institute for Global Dialogue in South Africa. This event bringing together the academic community and international organization to explore new thinking on the challenges and policy recommendations to finance sustainable development and to meet the post-COVID-19 challenges that are facing the world and especially the Southern Sphere. We are organizing this conference on 3 days that are covering 6 thematic panels and 3 special plenary sessions. The conference side event is our first international SDG contest, which has been announced back in July 2020 as an international contest addressing university students and graduates from Southern globe. The contest is about designing and carrying out a project serving the local community to get closer to achieving the global goals. And now I would like to extend my warm welcome and gratitude to my eminent guest and keynote speakers for our opening session today. At first, Professor Sriram Shulia, Professor and Dean of Jindal School of International Affairs, OP Jindal Global University in India, and Ambassador Professor Mohan Kumar, Professor and Dean of the Office of International Affairs and Global Initiatives of OP Jindal Global University in India. I'm really honored to invite Professor Shulia at first to start his welcome address and to announce the opening of our conference. Professor Shulia.
Hello, thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Adam. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, friends, from wherever you are logging in. On behalf of the School of International Affairs at OP Jindal Global University, I want to welcome you to what promises to be a very, very relevant and intellectually stimulating and policy-oriented event where we are talking about development finance in this extreme crisis situation and the way forward. So I think the whole world is puzzled with this extraordinary tragedy that's underway and how to emerge out of it. So no better time to organize something like this. So thank you, Professor Adam. Thank you to our Center for Global South at Jindal University for putting together this wonderful event. I want to acknowledge the participation of more than 120 scholars and activists and officials from a large number of countries. Registered participants include people from Algeria, from Egypt, from India, of course, the host country, Japan, Lebanon, Nepal, Nigeria, South Korea, Tunisia, and the United States. So this is quite a gathering, and I don't think it can get more global than this. And this is indeed, I hope that the outcome of this event will go a long way towards shaping new narratives about development finance. I was just reading that the landscape for development finance has transformed in the last decade quite dramatically, with new players coming in. So while the World Bank Group and some Western countries, especially the EU, continues to play an important role in overseas development assistance and other forms of aid that they give around the world, in the developing world, China has forged and become a big player. And in fact, the data from the Boston University's Research Center shows that from 2008 to 2019, China gave more than 460 billion I repeat, 460 billion US dollars in development assistance, which is equivalent or perhaps more than what the entire World Bank Group has done in the same time frame. So you can see a big transition in terms of the donor environment and the donor landscape, and which in turn has major implications for the recipient countries and for issues like economic growth, environmental sustainability, and sovereignty, and so on. Most people agree that the Chinese development assistance, which has become from a single country source, is the number one in the world. But if you compare to the World Bank as a whole, it's equivalent or more. So most people agree that the Chinese development assistance, the China's rise as a big donor, has enabled large infrastructure projects to come on board in many parts of the world, especially in Africa. And it has contributed to overall economic growth in the recipient countries. There's no question about it. GDP has risen. If you just go by the GDP metric, Chinese involvement has caused an increase in GDP growth, while the studies show that the World Bank's aid, which is cumulatively the equivalent of just China's aid, does not contribute to much economic growth. So to that extent, there's no gainsaying the fact that China is a player, and it's a big player, and perhaps the number one player in this field today. So for those of us who are older, we are all brought up on the idea that the global north gives to the global south, and that the global south receives in some form or the other. But where do you place China? So this is something I hope it will come up in the conference. And how do you situate China in this? Should we put China in global north now? Actually, in terms of, China is not an OECD member country. China is not a high income country. It's a middle income country. But because of the state driven policy making process there, they're able to channel a large amount of resources abroad. There's no questioning of it. I mean, since there's no challenge from within inside China because of its authoritarian system as to who's being given the money and why the money is being given. So the Belt and Road Initiative, which encompasses some of this 460 billion, but has other projects over and above this official development assistance. The BRI is a very top-down. It's designed by the top echelons of the Communist Party without necessarily much consultation within China. So to that extent, China is a unique donor, and it's neither, you can not call it a global north, at least not yet. And secondly, it's the first authoritarian state, large authoritarian state, that's doling out this amount of money that's never been seen before. So this has implications. So I mentioned what seems to be a positive side, which is high growth or enhanced GDP growth. But on the other hand, you have questions about debt and whether there is this debt trap. Many of us are familiar with this term. Our friends from Africa know it very well, also from other Asian countries in the Middle East. There has been a lot of concern about the Chinese debt trap and the conditionalities that they impose for giving aid. And this is something, of course, those with a longer memory remember the Washington Consensus and the Western aid that used to flow in earlier eras, which is now dried up. The World Bank is still there. Their conditionalities were no less destructive than what could be Chinese conditionalities. So in that sense, many people say, well, the West has no ground to be critical of China because you people you plundered our resources in the name of giving aid and in the name of development. And you people impose all kinds of market-based pressure to change our countries and our systems, and you destroyed many of our economies and all that. So there is this backlash against the Western criticism of China. But we in India have a different perspective, and I hope that also comes out in this conference. We have never plundered the resources of the global South, firstly. And secondly, there has not yet been a Mumbai consensus or a New Delhi consensus which we can impose on the world. So in that sense, there is, I think, a more objective analysis that can emerge from within the global south. And I hope that the participants will all consider how to critically evaluate Chinese assistance. So what is the criticism? The first, of course, is the debt and the whether this is sustainable, and what happens if you cannot repay your debt to China. We have a number of examples already. Gwadar port, for example, off the coast of Oman, in southern Pakistan, it has been taken over essentially by China because Pakistan cannot repay the debt on the basis of which Gwadar was built by China. Hambantota port of the southern tip of Sri Lanka in the Indian Ocean has been handed over to China for 99 years, a kind of a lease for it to operate. Kyaukpu in Myanmar, likewise. There could be more coming up in Bangladesh and elsewhere. So you have similar conditionalities being imposed by China on a country recipients like Cambodia, for example, where Chinese are building huge ports, huge transportation networks, power plants, but simultaneously asking for major concessions or essentially transfer of ownership for a long duration because the debtor cannot repay. So these problems, sovereign debt issues, are coming up this year due to the pandemic. The G20 has this debt service initiative to postpone debt repayments for LDCs, least developed countries, so that they can focus on the health crisis and overcoming the enormous losses in jobs and livelihoods and GDP growth caused by the collapse caused by this depression, the global depression. So waiving debt or deferring debt repayments is an important initiative. China is part of the G20. China apparently has waived up to 1.9 billion of its overseas debt so far. It has deferred the repayments. But like we have seen in countries like Maldives or Sri Lanka or Myanmar or Pakistan or Kazakhstan, you have countries which are receiving Chinese aid and which cannot repay it. So there is this big question mark of what happens to them. Are their sovereignties basically being bought? Is it just debt, or is it actually sovereignty that's being bought? And then what will be the conditionality? What kind of influence will China have on these countries? What will it do not only to their economies, but to their environmental record? Because a lot of the Chinese overseas assistance has been associated with environmental degradation and extractive industries. For example, most of the coal-fired power plants that generate the maximum carbon dioxide and other noxious greenhouse gases are being built around the world with Chinese development assistance. So in a way, it's a kind of an export of pollution on a global scale. So there are all these questions about debt, about sovereignty, about the environment, and last but not least, human rights. A number of countries, more than at least 50 known countries in the developing world, are receiving Chinese aid in the name of infrastructure and security and national security, but which are meant for surveillance and for monitoring their populations and for suppression of domestic dissent. So you have, if you take all these factors on one side, and then you have increase in GDP on the other hand, I will leave the participants to think about the pros and cons of this and whether this is good or bad or a mix. This new donor landscape. Apart from China, the real question is, what happens to multilateral development finance? The Chinese do it always bilaterally or through their own AIIB or BRI. But what about more broader multilateral? This is where, there are some interesting initiatives coming up. The problem, of course, is that everybody is down. The pandemic has not, unlike the 2008 global economic crisis, which had a differential damage in different parts of the world. For example, India and China continue to grow, while Europe and North America and Japan were flat. This time, it has brought down pretty much everybody, and this is the big problem. So even the Chinese are barely recovering, and it will take some time. But if you look at the other countries, almost everyone is on their knees, and the problem is that the recovery is going to be painful and slow. It's not going to be a V-shaped recovery, a quick rebound, and this means automatically that most of the ODA will decline or fall, because countries have to, first of all, they grapple with huge macroeconomic crises of their own. Forget assisting other developing countries with aid, with financial aid. So there is a big void staring at all of us. Perhaps, I mean, you know, there have been lots of calls for big private sector companies and global tech giants, for example, who spend so much on lobbying and on litigation and on marketing of their services. If they even allocate 1% of their annual profits to good causes such as debt servicing, or to waive off debts, or to get developing countries back on track in terms of balancing their budgets, it will solve the problem once and for all. But of course, private actors will for them to come in and take on things like bailing out countries. We have not seen that before. I mean, and if they do so, again, there will be like the Chinese type of, you know, pressures of their own, because market actors will want access and all kinds of concessions from recipient countries. What happens internally within the global south is also a very critical moment right now. There is, you know, unrest and potential revolutionary situation in many parts of the world. You have a lot of unrest in Latin America in the last 1 year or even 2 years, I would say, where people are out protesting inequality and shrinking economies and collapsing economies. So the pandemic has really, I think, set up a very volatile situation for domestic unrest in many parts of the world. We are already seeing manifestations of it across Africa, Latin America, and Asia. So there is also the question of domestic stability. So what is the meaning of receiving development aid or finance from external players if internally the state itself is crumbling, or is under severe pressure, or become fragile, or is likely to collapse? Just the other day, we were, Ambassador Mohan, Kumar and I were discussing with another distinguished retired Indian diplomat, Ambassador Yogendra Kumar, on his new book, Geopolitics in the Era of Globalization, where, you know, he says 50% of the world's population is likely to be living in fragile states by the next 10 years. That's, if the world's population is 7.5, 7.6 billion, we're talking about 3.8 or 4 billion people living in extremely fragile state structures. So weakening state institutions and state structures is a big problem. And historically, the World Bank Group, the Washington Consensus, the Americans, the Europeans, they all contributed to the weakening of the state structures by saying, you know, free market and let's open up, and we, you know, these countries need to undergo neoliberal restructuring. And many of these state institutions were made to fail. And that is the big, you know, criticism of the Washington Consensus. The Chinese, on the other hand, as I said, seem to be promoting a kind of state elites in many countries by giving them surveillance and monitoring tools to repress the society. So, which is not a solution either. So I think we need other paradigms other than the Western and the Chinese. And this is where I hope, see, India is struggling. All of us know it. We are also, we have just come out of minus 23% growth in this, the previous quarter, and again, almost double-digit negative growth this time. And we will take a long time to recover. So even our assistance in the neighboring countries, in Africa, South Asia and Africa are the main destinations of Indian overseas assistance. Even those are going to be struggling. The allocations we do annually are likely to take a hit because of this extreme cash crunch that all of us are facing. So was it the World Bank? Yeah, the World Bank is saying that until 2019, end of 2019, before the pandemic began, there were approximately 600 to 650 million people around the world living in abject poverty or absolute poverty. And now they're saying it's grown up to almost 800 million. So about 150 million more people have been impoverished almost entirely or absolutely because of the pandemic effect. And if Bill Gates, one of the far-sighted visionaries who saw the pandemic even 5 years ago, long before we had even heard of coronavirus, if Bill Gates is right, he's saying that the worst pain of the pandemic, both in terms of the deaths and the infections in many parts of the world, and the economic suffering, is yet to come, and will take another 4 to 6 months more before we can see any kind of light at the end of the tunnel. So if that is true, then we are all in for an extreme battering. And this is the reality. It's not a scaremongering. If you just look at the reality outside, I know many of you are engaged in your respective countries and regions with the local communities. You know there's a lot of suffering going on. So development finance, amid this kind of almost all negative indicators, it's a time of crisis. There's no question about it. To some, and there's some in the West who are saying now that the Joe Biden administration is going to come in the US, there's going to be a return to kind of a liberal, lending and multilateral platforms for promoting global public goods and such things. But frankly, the way the US is being battered by the virus, even if the vaccines start trickling in, it will easily take us almost the whole of 2021 or 2022 to just come back to the status quo ante of before the pandemic. So I'm presenting a bleak picture and mentioning most of the problems that we are facing today. So it's important that I think the solutions have to come from locally and from within the Global South, which is of course the motto of our Center for Global South here, that we do not believe in dependency. We do not believe in aid per se. And I think there ought to be fairer trade. There ought to be, broader consensus about technology and such things that will ultimately bring about growth in the Global South. Donors cannot bring about growth. So that 1.5% to 2% increase uptick in growth that is being mentioned as a result of Chinese assistance the last 10 to 12 years, I think is also a misnomer, but because you all know very well how GDP is distributed in countries. And the Chinese projects generally are in close alliance with the elites in developing countries and do not necessarily trickle down to the ordinary people. And therefore, there's a lot of resistance. So I think I cannot think of a new vehicle that can turbocharge the global economy and bring us out of crises and bring developing countries out of crises. But it is a time for solidarity. And I hope that we in the South will support each other to the extent we can, even though we all have domestic crises of our own to manage. And we promote always the alternative vision. I think it is time for us to have a third paradigm. It's always been there. You remember during the Cold War period, we had the non-aligned movement, and we had an alternative paradigm to the Soviet and the American models. And today, I dare say, there is a new Cold War between China and the US, and we must continue to promote an alternative third vision for development finance, for growth, for sustainability, for democratic governance, and all these things. So I hope the participants and the panelists will think about these larger questions I've raised today, and I hope that something comes out of this which we can put before policymakers, so that India, Egypt, these are some of the major developing countries, but also others who are participating in our respective regions, we spread the word that there must be an alternative paradigm, and that we cannot allow ourselves to become dependent on big donors. And we will need to look back into the strengths of our own people, our own communities, and come up with low-cost solutions to many of our problems. We've seen that already in Africa. It's been very successful, relatively speaking, in managing the coronavirus pandemic due to regional integration and the Centers for African Centers for Disease Control and people's involvement in public health. So I think going forward, economic development is a much bigger menu than just public health. Public health is in a way part of it. So it's a long haul, and we must first of all survive this pandemic, and we must somehow prevent the collapse of states and large-scale armed uprisings and rebellions and those kind of problems. But we must at the same time make sure that states are not using the pandemic as a basis for repression with the support of the Chinese or any other external backers. So that's the agenda, and I hope this conference touches on some of these themes, and we come up with as this, what is the phrase nowadays, the saying, we have to build back better. This is the global phrase, the UN and everybody is promoting build back better. We in the global south have to come up with our own models to build back better. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Sholia, for your insightful presentation and this speech that you have addressed. And we agree with you in Jindal Centre for Global South. We are working on that goal of promoting Global South solidarity and, of course, the South-South cooperation. Now, I would like to invite Professor Mohan Kumar to give his precious input to our opening session. And also, I would like to highlight in my presentation, when I was speaking about Professor Mohan, he is also, I will add that he is a founding member of our center. So, and he is my personal mentor. So I would like to give now the talk to Professor Mohan.
Thank you, Professor Hebatullah Adam. I thought Professor Shriram Cholia has said it all, but I do want to place on record that it was just a year ago, a little more than a year, when I remember Heba walking into my room and saying, can we have this center? What is the name of the center? So I must honestly place on record, Heba, that this is an amazing achievement for a center which is so young. I see that you've got a 3-day conference, and as Professor Cholia said, such an impressive array of speakers. It is quite an amazing achievement, and I say it without any flattery. Really, you deserve a lot of praise for having come up with this excellent idea. I only want to say a few things. I think it'll be good if this conference can be anchored on the Addis Ababa agenda of 2015. One of the great things about somebody calling me for things like this is that I'm forced to read something. So Heba, you have forced me to read the sustaining for, I was going through the UN report, which is the High Task Force report on financing for development last night. And then I also learned a little bit about the Addis Ababa action agenda. And I think if your conference can take a completely objective look at this agenda, which was inaugurated by the UN Secretary General and others in 2015. And in 2020, if you take a look at what has been achieved, the Secretary General's own report says that there has been backsliding in official development assistance. So as Professor Cholia said, it's not just the pandemic. There are very negative trends when it comes to financing for development. So I must compliment you for this conference, because if you don't do things like this, this will fall off the radar. The world will just move on to vaccine and other things, and everybody will forget about financing for development. So I would say that that is an excellent reason why your conference, I think, has done a wonderful job by at least having this issue. Like Professor Cholia, I don't know what conclusions and what solutions you can come up with, but just to concentrate the minds of the policymakers that this is an important issue and it can't just be brushed under the carpet. I just wanted to say, frankly, that we have 4 different ways in which development can be financed, frankly. You've got the domestic public resources, you've got the domestic private resources, you've got official development assistance, and of course, then you have international trade, by which countries which trade so that their exports can rise and foreign exchange reserves can be accumulated through trade and through remittances from abroad. These are really the known. I'm leaving out multilateral, but you can include multilateral institutions as well. The problem I see today, frankly, Heba, is that on every single issue, there is a negative scorecard because the domestic public sector, governments are struggling, as Professor Cholia said, to cope with coronavirus. And so governments are also short of funds, which otherwise would be available for such things. So that is one. On domestic private sector, if countries are going to be dependent on tourism, hospitality, and regular manufacturing, that is also gone for a 6 because of corona. The only thing that I think is prospering is Amazon and things like that. But otherwise, we are just finished in terms of traditional manufacturing, in terms of traditional hospitality, tourism, hospitality. You've got education. Everything has been battered, as Professor Cholia said, battered by the coronavirus. So domestic private sector will also complain that if we are not selling anything, why do you ask us to contribute toward development? It's very difficult. We are living hand to mouth for most small scale companies and even big companies. So that's gone. The third, official development assistance. This is where I think the High Task Force report is worth looking at for this conference. It clearly says there is a backsliding. And forget about the traditional goal of 1.6, 0.6% is what we expect countries, developed countries, as a proportion of the GDP. That goal established by UNCTAD has never been met, except by some Scandinavian countries now and then, but even they are backsliding. So official development assistance has gone for a 6, and that is also not forthcoming. So that leaves only multilateral lending. And in multilateral lending, I don't want to repeat the points already made by Professor Cholia and Chinese aid. And in any case, Chinese aid has also dramatically reduced. It was a very high figure of 400 billion, as you said, Professor Sriram Cholia, but that is also dramatically reduced. They're also retrenching and holding back. So we have a real difficult situation. And the G20 in Saudi Arabia came up with what is known as a debt servicing initiative to suspend debt. Basically, it's a debt suspension that the G20 has pronounced. Unfortunately, that is not enforceable, but that is what we should be doing. I don't see how can even repay the debt and the interest in this kind of a situation. So unless there are steps taken to suspend debt and suspend interest payments, it'll be very, very difficult for countries to actually cope with the present situation. So in this scenario, as was asked, what do we do? I mean, I would frankly say that 2 or 3 things we can do, and I will then finish my speech because I don't want to really extend this inaugural session. We have an opportunity again to meet and we can discuss in detail. But one I would say is definitely the emergency lending arm of the IMF. I think that should be activated in my view. There's no reason why. That is what it is meant for. And that is something that we should clearly press in the conference, that listen, you can't say that it is business as usual. It is stupid to say that. When countries are really suffering, at least the least developed countries, I would say, there may not be a consensus on other countries, but at least least developed countries have every right to expect emergency lending. That's one. Second, I would say that there has got to be some attempt to persuade foundations like the Bill Gates Melinda Foundation, other foundations which have a lot of funds at their disposal and which are well-meaning. The only assurance they would need is that they want efficient, bona fide utilization of funds. Obviously, they don't want the funds to be misutilized. So that is something that we would have to do. The last one I would say is, and this is something, Heba, you've been with RIS, you know what RIS does, is South-South cooperation. After all, you are the executive director of the Jindal Centre for Global South. And Professor Cholia mentioned the word solidarity. But how do you convert solidarity into concrete action? Maybe this is a time to give a renewed fillip to South-South cooperation. And here I would say the following. I would say if you take vaccine production, frankly, we have an initiative in the WTO yesterday where India, South Africa, Brazil, we have presented a proposal saying that at least as long as the pandemic lasts, please don't insist on TRIPS agreement and patents. And this was refused by the developed countries. Now, it is not as if India is saying we are saying goodbye to the TRIPS agreement. Our interest is that if we have vaccines in India which exceed our requirements, we should be able to export it to countries which don't have manufacturing capacity. Now, this will be prevented by a company like Pfizer, which will immediately apply for a patent in a least developed country. So if it does that, then India cannot supply there, because Pfizer will get the approval and then Pfizer will sell it at $25 or $30 a vaccine. So this is really about South-South cooperation. And I feel we should push this point strongly to tell countries that, listen, what is a better way of doing South-South cooperation than Indian manufacturing trying to rise to the occasion? And we're going to be also participating in the Gavi initiative. The Serum Institute in Pune is also going to contribute to the Gavi initiative of the World Bank to deliver and to manufacture vaccines for low-income countries. So my biggest worry is that the COVID should not have the unintended effect of massively increasing inequality in the world, where you will have two categories of citizens, one who are vaccinated and one who are not vaccinated. And imagine what would happen to those who are not vaccinated. The country itself will not be part of air bubbles. They can't travel, because if you're not vaccinated, you cannot travel in the future. If you cannot travel, your economic opportunities are affected, and things that come from your country cannot be, access to developed country markets. So I see very serious implications if we do not get this intellectual property right angle when it comes to producing and making vaccines. And finally, I would say that international trade has also got an important role to play. And I'm hoping that now that the USTR has been selected, Ms. Catherine Tai, I don't know how you pronounce her, TAI, but she is a USTR. She will have to now take initiative and try to see that the WTO is back in business. Frankly, we have a very narrow window of opportunity for the WTO to be back in business, because if you do not have security and predictability for international trade, then again, low-income countries are the ones which will suffer most. Other countries will find a way to export, but low-income countries, without the multilateral trading system benefiting them, will not be able to export and import things. So I would say, Heba, that it is a very, very timely conference. But as Professor Cholia also said, and unfortunately, I'm forced to share his pessimism. And if you do look at the High Task Force report, that's what it says. And this is a 2020 report, by the way. So it's post-pandemic. Almost on every indicator, we are sliding backwards. And so if your conference can do three things: one, highlight this backsliding, because you have to do it. Most people will not read the report. So your conference has to put out this message that there is a backsliding in all the criteria that was established by the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. Second, can we stop this backsliding at least to begin with? And third, allow countries, at least like India and others, to export vaccines, because we cannot afford vaccine inequality in the country. That will accentuate economic inequality, and that will lead to a very, very nefarious situation for the world. So I'm going to stop here, Heba, and I also look forward to participating in your evening conference. So once again, thank you for this opportunity, and my most sincere congratulations to you and your center. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mohan Kumar, for your continuous support and encouragement for me and to the center, and your insightful presentation this morning. So now, before ending this inspiring and encouraging opening session, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to Professor Shriram Shoria, the Professor and Dean of Jindal Centre for Jindal School of International Affairs, and Professor Mohan Kumar, Professor and Dean of the Office of International Affairs and Global Initiatives at OP Jindal Global University. Thank you, professors, for making your time and being with me today to announce the opening of our first international conference. I hope that next year we are going to have the second international conference, but it will be on campus, I hope, and we'll pass this pandemic situation. Thank you so much. And also, before we end, I would like to send my sincere thanks to all our audience from around the world that are following us now on YouTube. We shall come back together again at 1 p.m. IST to start the first thematic panel session of our conference, which is going to be on health sector and challenges of COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mohan.
Bye.